June 26, 1941. A muddy road outside Brody, Ukraine. The air smelled of wet earth and diesel, a low rumble traveling through the soles of boots and the ribs of wooden crates. Men squinted through rain and exhaust, saw a boxy silhouette lumber out of a field, and one of the German officers laughed so loudly the sound seemed to push the clouds aside. They called it a tractor, a clumsy farm machine with a turret bolted on. Someone said it was good for hauling grain, not for knocking out a Panzer. The laughter curled with contempt. That contempt would be corrected in ways that no one at the roadside that day could imagine. Within months, men who had scoffed would count the cost in wreckage, in lost columns, in entire doctrine rewritten. 57,000 in factories over years, a top speed near 45 kilometers per hour, an armor angling that made a 35mm plate behave like twice its thickness when struck. This is the story of how an unglamorous design philosophy, industrial discipline, and a stubborn crew turned what some called a tractor into a tank that would fold enemy formations into scrap. It is a story of prototype sketches, of factory floors that never slept, of crews who learned to fight by habit and by improvisation, and of a rival who misread strength for awkwardness. Over the next hours, we will follow invention, training, catastrophe, tactical rebirth, decisive engagements, production surges, and the long aftershocks that reshaped armored warfare. The T-34 did not appear overnight. In a narrow office with a window steamed by winter breath, a young designer named Mikhail, with oil under his nails and a cigarette stub, bent the rules just far enough to make a wiser compromise. He argued for sloped armor as an idea, not a theory. He scribbled cross-sections on the back of requisition forms, calling for fewer parts, a wide track set for mud and snow, and a diesel engine that would not ignite as readily as petrol in a burning hull. He said we need to accept imperfect ergonomics to win reliability. The lead engineer, Petrov, looked at the rough drawings and said, "This will be heavy to produce, but it will survive." An early prototype rolled out in a winter of cold breath and brighter sparks. In the factory, the foreman, Anatoly, barked orders over a chorus of hammers. Workers smelled hot metal and coal, felt the vibrations in their shoulders, tasted the iron flakes on their tongues when they coughed. A test driver named Ivan climbed into the cramped turret and felt the controls like a new language. He reported that the wide tracks chewed through plowed fields where a Panzer would bog. Petrov wrote that the curvature of the front plate at 30 degrees reduced penetration probability. At a public demonstration, a visiting colonel raised one eyebrow and joked about comfort. This was the origin story, technical and political, an industrial gospel of lower tolerances and mass manufacturability. Numbers mattered. Fewer rivets, a simplified turret ring, standardized parts that could be turned on lathe after lathe across dozens of plants. A prototypical quote from the designer appeared in a factory memo. "I did not design elegance, I designed for survival." And that sentence would be repeated in barracks and briefings as if it were a prayer. Training started with humility and accidents. Crews who had known only light tractors or improvised armored cars learned that a new psychology was required inside a metal box. Lieutenant Sergei, assigned to the 8th Tank Brigade, read aloud the manual and cursed at the cramped periscope placement. He barked at his loader, "The radio is beneath the seat, not intuitive. Find a way to make it fast." The loader answered, "I will rig a strap, Lieutenant," and he did. In maneuvers, the T-34's short vision slit made commanders compensate by trusting juniors to call distances. In one early exercise, a platoon commander named Victor misread terrain and drove into a ravine, the suspension groaning. He and his crew climbed out with bloodied knuckles and bruised pride. Accident reports filled the back of command notebooks. Statistics recorded losses to non-combat causes in the first months that were nearly as high as those inflicted by mines and artillery. The new crews smelled burning clutch and tasted the metallic tang of brake dust. They learned to sleep on the engine casing in freezing nights and to talk in low voices about repairs. A medical officer counted frostbite cases and scrawled recommendations for thicker gloves. The command dilemma was plain: press the new design forward at the cost of men learning on real battlefields, or hold them back and risk being overrun. The decision was made to send them forward because survival in the field would be, in itself, a teacher. First clashes were the kindergarten of hard lessons and stubborn successes. On a fogged morning, a sergeant named Kozlov watched a German Panzer column pushing down a farm lane. Kozlov whispered into the radio, "Enemy in front, 2 Panzers," staccato in a voice steadier than his hands. His commander, Lieutenant Petrov, shouted orders. They crept, smelled wet canvas and burning oil, heard the distant clack of tracks on cobbles. In the first exchange, the T-34 took a round that glanced off a sloped face and tasted the heat of combustion while the crew spat curses. The Panzer's main gun had a longer tube but struck at the wrong angle. Kozlov fired back with a 76mm shell, and the sound arrived like a sudden hunger, a concussive note that made windows shiver. There was talk after, terse and sharp, 8 exchanges of command and reply as gunners and drivers adjusted. Driver to commander, track clear. Commander to gunner, target, now. Gunner to loader, shell ready. Loader to loader, ramming home. Gunner, fire. Shell punched through the Panzer's side, gasoline vapor bloomed, and the enemy tank stalled like a struck beast. The Germans who had mocked the silhouette at Brody later found themselves south of Kiev, counting casualties and changing their manuals. Word spread. A case lore formed around Kozlov and others, a story told with the taste of soot and the smell of scorched rubber. Tactics evolved with a stubborn pragmatism. Field commanders who could see past the initial clumsiness learned to exploit the T-34's advantages. The tank's mobility on rough terrain, wide tracks that gave traction where a Panzer sank, meant that boom and zoom in the armor sense could be translated into flanking maneuvers at battalion level. A captain named Mikhail taught his section to use reverse slope positions in hills where the German gunner's line of sight bent awkwardly. He barked commands in rehearsed cadences. Hold, watch, prepare to pivot. A young commander, Dmitri, rerouted an attack through a marshy patch that the Germans assumed impossible, the T-34s crossing like beasts with hooves. Dialogue in those moments was rapid and full. Driver to commander, there is a bog here. Commander to driver, trust the track. Gunner to commander, I see movement 600 meters left of crest. Commander, fire 20 degrees left. Loader, ready. Gunner, fire. The effect was tactical, though not theatrical. The Germans had designed for prepared ground and long ranges. The Soviets, with T-34s, designed for disruption, for breaking columns in places where supply and maneuver were most vulnerable. Commanders like Mikhailov and Dmitri became exemplars, their names uttered in briefings as men who read terrain and turned what others called a tractor into a machine for creating openings. There were larger engagements that converted regional advantage into strategic consequence. At Kursk, the calculus of armor met in sun and dust and metal. Briefings were dense with maps. A general named Nikolai argued for mobile defensive belts, layers of minefields and anti-tank riflement, and placing T-34 brigades in depth. He said, "We cannot beat them in frontal industrial quality, but we can multiply attrition." In staff rooms, the sound of pencils scratching plans mingled with coffee breath, and paper maps smelled faintly of oil and tobacco. A liaison officer named Anna read the telemetry and said, "Our men will be tired, but the T-34s can outrun the Panzers in these sectors." The battle that followed consumed numbers that made anonymous the faces of loss and victory. Tens of thousands of vehicles entered and left the chessboard. The T-34s performed in bursts of maneuver, exploiting reverse slopes, interlocking fields of fire, and leapfrogging maintenance crews. Reports tallied destroyed tanks, repaired units, and supply tonnages. The German command took note of an unexpected pattern of losses and began to send requests back to factories for guns with higher muzzle velocity. Tactical manuals were revised and tactical units adapted. But the weight of production and adaptation lay elsewhere, on assembly lines and in rails. Industrial response scaled the design from awkward prototype to prolific instrument. Factories from Kharkiv to Chelyabinsk retooled. Night shifts extended into daylight by crews that moved with the rhythm of conveyor belts and a new religion of throughput. Commissar Yegor paced factory lofts and called for parts, his voice bouncing on iron rafters. Nina the mechanic tightened turrets until dusk, and Foreman Anatoly rewrote shift charts so that lathes never cooled. Standardized parts allowed rails to feed workshops like arteries. A description of the production process shows bolts stacked, plates stamped, turrets latched, and engines rolled out. Workers smelled hot rivets and the tang of oil. Mechanics tasted metal dust in cold mornings. The logistic feats were staggering. In 1942 and 1943, production doubled in certain factories as Soviet planners balanced raw material flows, train schedules, and priorities. The German reaction was to design new models like Panther, to field heavier guns and experiment with ammunition types that pierced sloped armor. But industrial inertia is hard to reverse. For each new enemy gun, there was a counter in numbers and replacement time. By late 1943, the tally of tanks on rails became a weapon in itself. The strategic lesson was brutal and clear: the ability to replace losses and sustain operations repeatedly, with a design forgiving enough to accept field repairs, outpaced the doctrinal superiority of the enemy. There are moments in combat that read like miracles and nightmares. One such moment involved a crew. Commander Petrov, gunner Sokolov, loader Masha, driver Anya, and radio operator Lev. Their tank took a direct hit to the turret ring that should have immobilized the mechanism. The moment was full of sounds: the scream of metal, the clink of fragments, the thud of a human heart in the ears. Petrov yelled, "Can anyone move the turret? We are stuck." Sokolov replied, "I will try, cover me." Masha grunted as she unbolted a fractured latch, while Anya held position and felt the heat through the floor like a second sun. Lev sent a one-line message: "We are pinned, pray." The team worked with oil-stained fingers and improvised tools. They heard enemy boots approaching and smelt the acrid smoke of spent shells. For 2 minutes that felt like an ocean of time, they worked in tandem: push, pry, hammer, breathe. Sokolov screamed as his knuckles split, but the turret turned. Masha loaded, Sokolov fired, and the enemy vehicle fell back. They escaped with scorched paint and a story they would tell for decades. That is a survival miracle, and it shows the human variable in the machinery of war. Technical descriptions appear constantly in reports and pilots' manuals. The T-34 sloped hull converted a 35mm nominal thickness into an effective resistance considerably higher because incoming fire struck at an oblique angle, deflecting rounds. The Christie suspension allowed for wider track distribution, reducing ground pressure and improving mobility across mud and snow. The B-2 diesel engine offered greater fuel economy and lower flammability compared to gasoline engines of contemporaries. Simplicity of parts reduced time. In field overhaul, with many components swapped by crews with basic tools, these processual descriptions show how a design philosophy focused on survivability and maintainability rather than on peak performance in a test track produced a reliable battlefield presence. At roughly 1/3 of this narrative, pause a moment for engagement. Tell us about a time when a technical fact changed your mind. Start your comment with "I changed when" and share the incident. Did a single figure, a specification, or a detail alter your view on something you once dismissed? We will read and highlight selected stories in upcoming episodes because these personal shifts echo the historic ones we just narrated. Now back to the story. Enemy countermeasures grew more sophisticated as the war continued. German Panzer schools modified their gunnery drills, emphasizing higher angle tracking and coordinated artillery suppression. Hans Richter, a Panzer captain, was recorded in an intercepted log, noting that the T-34 sloped armor blunted our rounds and forced us to aim more precisely at weak points. Oberleutnant Klaus Reber recommended changes to doctrine, suggesting that combined arms be prioritized against T-34 formations. The debate in German staff circles moved between tactical fixes and strategic evaluations. They deployed new models and improved ammunition, but each adaptation required production time. Meanwhile, Soviet industry multiplied outputs, and technicians like Nina and Anatoly developed quicker field repair kits. The logistical chain became an offensive tool, a force multiplier that turned spare parts into front-line endurance. Numbers again. Rail cars of replacements moved thousands of kilometers. Able-bodied workers made field workshops in forests and barns, and tanks that could be towed and patched returned to the line rapidly. The contest ceased to be one of pure engineering genius alone and became a race of repair and replacement. Variants multiplied. The original 76.2mm gun variants evolved into heavier turreted models with improved optics, and later the 85mm variant that came to challenge heavy German tanks at greater ranges. Specialized versions carried mine-clearing equipment, flamethrowers for city fighting, and engineering attachments for river crossings. The tactical envelope of the T-34 expanded from ambush and disruption to spearhead of assaults and support of infantry in urban operations. In the Pacific-like theaters and on the steppe, the same principles applied. Wide tracks for soft ground, simple parts for austere supply lines, and crews that learned improvisation in the field. Secondary characters appear throughout these adaptations. Commissar Yegor, who negotiated resource allocations in winter meetings, Mechanic Nita, who invented a quicker turret ring replacement technique, Foreman Anatoly, who managed shifts, Lieutenant Sergei, who taught new recruits to read terrain, Captain Mikhailov, who wrote tactic notes, Dmitry the driver, who pioneered marsh crossing formations, and Anna the liaison, who coordinated artillery and tank moves. Each had specific actions. Yegor moved raw steel, Nina redesigned a tool, Anatoly extended shifts, Sergei implemented a vision training drill, Mikhailov wrote a memo repeated in doctrine, Dmitry led a successful flank, Anna saved a convoy with timely artillery smokes. These names recur because wars are made by many hands, not by a single hero. There were decisive operations that sealed reputations and changed war maps. The advance after Stalingrad relied on armored columns that pushed through weakened fronts. In one campaign, a brigade led by Lieutenant Colonel Abramov cut a supply line that funneled fuel to German armor, trapping units and forcing surrender. Tactical dialogue in the field included terse calls. Column, prepare to pivot, adjust speed, fire on the supply wagons, hold until infantry clears. The result was a cascade of logistical collapse for enemy formations that could not replace fuel or ammunition. The strategic effect was to increase attrition rates and shorten front stabilization times. Reports tallied captured vehicles, prisoners, and the tonnage of supplies diverted. From Berlin to remote command posts, these losses forced reallocation of resources and contributed to an operational momentum the Germans could not match. Two sustained moments of tension illustrate individual and systemic stress. First, in a frozen night, an entire repair depot was under threat. Sparks flew as technicians like Nina and Anatoly scrambled to replace engines and weld turret rings. German reconnaissance was close, and the depot smelled of grease and fear. Workers whispered about evacuation routes. A skirmish broke out on the perimeter where a small detachment of tanks held against incoming scouts. Decisions were made in a flurry, and orders from command came through with a harshness that matched the wind. Pull back the most damaged, keep the others in repair rotation. There was a tension between saving equipment and saving lives, and the choice made left marks on men and machines. Second, during a grinding siege, a platoon with minimal fuel waited in ambush for a supply column. Men tasted cold and rationed tea, Heard distant artillery like a constant throat clearing. A command arrived, attack at dusk. The soldiers debated, argued, then agreed. Their actions consumed minutes that felt like hours, and when they struck, the ambush worked, but with cost in men and tanks. Each moment was 500 to 600 characters of breathless decision, despair, and small triumph. The human calculus of war with metal as the medium. As the war moved toward attrition, the enemy adapted their tactics and their equipment. But strategic industrial capacity told a different story. American Lend-Lease aided material flows. Railway logistics kept spare parts moving, and Soviet factories multiplied the T-34 variants. The capacity to churn out replacements, to adapt designs, and to teach new crews at scale was decisive. The Germans increasingly referred to the T-34 not as a tractor, but as a persistent problem that modernized their own doctrine. Testimonies from enemy officers later expressed regret over initial dismissals. Hans Richter would write years later, "We laughed then, and we paid for that laugh." The numbers were stark. Thousands of tanks replaced, millions of tons of munitions expended, production lines that scaled like engines in an ecosystem. The U.S. Air Force, the mid-20s. Legacy of these years influenced armored doctrine for decades, demonstrating that a robust, simple, easily produced design with mobility and maintainability could outlast a numerically superior technology in tactical quality. In the epilogue, the story continues in 3 temporal beats. 1 month after the decisive push, replacement trains still smelled of coal, but morale was tentative. Units counted their dead and patched their metal. Crews like Petrov's received new road wheels and a fresh set of vision prisms. The front lines stabilized in regions with new patterns of patrols and ambushes. Reports emphasized logistics and spare parts over individual heroics, and commanders wrote directives prioritizing repair trains and field workshops. The immediate effect was consolidation. 3 months later, the strategic picture had shifted more decisively. Industrial plants operated on extended shifts, parts kits were standardized, and junior technicians had become masters of field improvisation. The T-34 had moved from prototype to symbol. Training manuals included sections on angle of impact, and turret maintenance gleaned from field repairs. Battle reports now use the name T-34 as shorthand for reliability and persistence. 6 months after the turning point, the consequences had matured into doctrine. Enemy divisions reissued their manuals, investing in heavier guns and revised tactics, but they also acknowledged the industrial advantage they could not easily match. Factories had become as important as forts, supply chains as decisive as battalions. Politicians and generals in post-war assessments would call this a war not only of battles, but of rails, shops, and the capacity to sustain. The human costs remained heavy, the faces behind statistics permanent. Final assessments blend sentiment and analysis. Those who once laughed at a tractor shaped by necessity later called it a harbinger of a new era in armored warfare. Production figures, 57,000 plus in long-term tallies, and process metrics like mean time between failures dramatically improved through modular parts show how industrial logic can beat initial technical prejudice. Testimonies from both sides confirm a shift in respect. Germans admitted they had misread the utility of sloped armor and the effect of mass production. Soviet veterans recalled the smell of hot oil, the constant touch of grease, and the warm, stubborn feeling of machines that could be brought back from death by a strip of welded steel and an improvised wrench. Every figure in a ledger equaled a person somewhere, a mechanic who missed a child's birth, a driver who learned the contours of a field by touch. If there is a single conclusion, it is that in modern war, an idea that is rugged, producible, and paired with relentless logistical practice can outlast more elegant but brittle solutions. If you want to keep following stories where engineering and human willingness collide, subscribe and join us for the next episode. When you see a silhouette on a muddy road, remember that what looks awkward may simply be a form waiting to be understood.